The United States has long been viewed as a global leader in democratic governance, and its presidential elections often capture worldwide attention. These elections are not just contests for political power. They are powerful reflections of the country's values, priorities, and deep-rooted historical struggles. From the first election of George Washington in 1789 to the fiercely contested races of the 21st century, U.S. presidential elections have evolved alongside the nation itself, shaped by civil wars, civil rights movements, economic upheavals, and the advancement of technology. Understanding U.S. politics and presidential elections requires more than knowing who is on the ballot. It demands a look into the foundational structures and historical developments that shaped the modern electoral process. From the birth of the Constitution to landmark Supreme Court decisions, and from the rise of political parties to the expansion of voting rights, the American political landscape has been anything but static. By examining the historical roots of U.S. governance and elections, we gain insight into how power has been won, lost, and redefined over time. The foundations of the U.S. political system were laid in the aftermath of the American Revolution, as the newly independent states sought to unify under a single federal government while preserving individual liberties. The U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788, became the supreme law of the land and introduced a system of checks and balances through three separate branches of government: the executive, headed by the president; the legislative, Congress; and the judicial, Supreme Court and lower federal courts. This structure was heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideals and designed to prevent the concentration of power in any one entity, particularly in reaction to the monarchy they had just overthrown. From the beginning, debates emerged about the balance of power between the federal government and the states, a tension that continues to influence American politics. Federalism was enshrined in the Constitution, giving specific powers to the national government while reserving others for the states. These debates would eventually lead to key historical conflicts, including the Civil War, which fundamentally reshaped the nation's understanding of federal authority and civil rights. Political parties were not part of the original design, but soon emerged, beginning with the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. These early divisions laid the groundwork for the two-party system that dominates American politics today. Over time, party ideologies shifted dramatically in response to national crises, such as the Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Cold War, each altering the balance of power and the issues at the heart of American political debate. Thus, the political system of the United States is a product of both deliberate design and historical evolution, shaped by centuries of conflict, compromise, and the ongoing pursuit of a more perfect union. Though the U.S. Constitution made no mention of political parties, they quickly became a defining feature of American politics. The first party system emerged in the 1790s, with Federalists, who favored a strong central government, and Democratic Republicans, who supported states' rights and agrarian interests. The rivalry between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson marked the beginning of ideological divisions that would evolve into full-blown party politics. By the 1820s, the Federalist Party had faded, and the Democratic-Republican Party splintered, giving rise to the Democratic Party, formally founded by Andrew Jackson, which emphasized populism and states' rights. In reaction to Jacksonian politics, the Whig Party arose, advocating for modernization and federal investment, but it collapsed by the 1850s, largely over the issue of slavery. In 1854, abolitionist factions united to form the Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. The party's first successful presidential candidate, Abraham Lincoln, won in 1860, triggering the secession of Southern states and the onset of the Civil War. From that point onward, the U.S. became solidly entrenched in a two-party system: Democrats and Republicans. Over the decades, both parties shifted dramatically. Republicans, originally the party of emancipation, became associated with business interests and conservatism by the 20th century. The Democrats, especially after FDR's New Deal in the 1930s, increasingly aligned with labor unions, civil rights, and social welfare programs. The civil rights movement of the 1960s marked another ideological realignment. Southern Democrats, alienated by their party's support for desegregation, gravitated toward the Republican Party, while Democrats consolidated their base among minorities and urban voters. These shifts still define modern political divisions. Despite being a two-party system, third parties such as the Progressive Party, Libertarians, Greens, and Reform Party have occasionally influenced elections and national debates, though they rarely win major offices due to structural barriers like the Electoral College and single-member districts. The process of electing a U.S. president has evolved significantly since George Washington was unanimously chosen by the Electoral College in 1789. Initially, electors had more discretion, often choosing elite candidates without public campaigning. But as the 19th century progressed, especially with the rise of Jacksonian democracy, voting rights expanded, at first to all white men, and elections became more direct and populist. The Electoral College, created as a compromise between those who wanted Congress to choose the president and those who preferred a popular vote, still determines the outcome. Each state receives a number of electoral votes based on its congressional representation, and most states use a winner-takes-all system. While it reflects federalism, the system has also produced controversial outcomes, such as the elections of 2000, Bush versus Gore, and 2016, Trump versus Clinton, where candidates won the presidency without winning the popular vote. Before the general election, primaries and caucuses are held in each state to determine the party's nominees. This system was not standardized until the 20th century. The first binding presidential primary was held in 1912, but it wasn't until the chaotic Democratic Convention of 1968 that reforms were introduced, increasing voter control over nominations. The National Party conventions are modern spectacles, showcasing party unity and officially nominating the presidential candidate and their running mate. Then comes the general election, held every 4 years on the Tuesday following the first Monday in November. Voters cast their ballots for electors pledged to a candidate. In December, these electors formally vote, and the results are certified by Congress in January. Despite occasional calls for reform or abolition of the Electoral College, it remains in place, a lasting legacy of the nation's founding compromises. Presidential campaigns have always been shaped by the tools of communication available during their time. In the early years of the Republic, campaigning was seen as unseemly. George Washington never openly sought the presidency. Instead, candidates relied on pamphlets, letters, and newspapers to build public support indirectly. By the mid-1800s, mass rallies, political songs, and newspapers aligned with parties became common, as candidates like Andrew Jackson embraced a populist approach. The use of campaign slogans, buttons, and public spectacles intensified, setting the stage for modern political branding. The 20th century marked a revolution in campaign strategy. The 1924 election was the first to use radio, allowing candidates to reach audiences nationwide. But it was the 1960 televised debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon that truly transformed media's role in politics. Kennedy's polished appearance and calm demeanor gave him an edge, proving that image could now sway voters more than words alone. As television took over, political advertising became central to campaigns. The infamous Daisy ad in 1964, run by Lyndon B. Johnson's campaign against Barry Goldwater, marked a new era of emotionally charged, fear-based political advertising. Campaign managers began hiring professional media consultants, and the science of optics, polling, and messaging was born. By the 21st century, the internet and especially social media revolutionized political communication. Barack Obama's 2008 campaign was groundbreaking for its use of online fundraising, grassroots mobilization via digital platforms, and data analytics to micro-target voters. In contrast, Donald Trump's 2016 campaign leveraged Twitter as a direct communication tool, bypassing traditional media and reshaping political discourse with instant controversial messaging. Campaigns also became increasingly expensive. The rise of political action committees, PACs, and later super PACs, after the Citizens United vs. FEC ruling in 2010, allowed for unlimited political spending by corporations and interest groups. This decision intensified the influence of money in politics, giving rise to concerns about the power of wealthy donors and the erosion of democratic access. From the printing press to TikTok, campaign strategy in U.S. presidential elections has always adapted to the dominant media of the day, shaping not only how candidates present themselves, but also how voters perceive them. Throughout U.S. history, presidential elections have often pivoted around the most urgent issues of their time, each reflecting the social, economic, and political currents sweeping the nation. In the 19th century, slavery and states' rights dominated. The election of 1860, won by Abraham Lincoln, was a direct trigger for the Civil War, as Southern states saw his anti-slavery stance as a threat to their way of life. Post-war elections wrestled with Reconstruction, civil rights for freed slaves, and the expansion of federal authority. In the early 20th century, industrialization, labor rights, and economic reform were central. The progressive era saw candidates like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson address corporate monopolies, working conditions, and government corruption. The Great Depression made economic relief and job creation the top issues of the 1932 election, bringing Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal policies to power. The Cold War era introduced new concerns. Anti-communism, national security, and foreign policy became dominant themes from the 1950s to the 1980s. Elections during this time, such as the 1964 and 1980 races, reflected fear of nuclear war, the Vietnam conflict, and the desire for strong leadership in a divided world. In the 1960s and 70s, civil rights, racial justice, and women's rights gained momentum. Lyndon B. Johnson's support for the Civil Rights Act helped him win re-election in 1964, but cost the Democrats Southern support. The 1972 election was marked by the Vietnam War and the growing power of anti-establishment youth movements. By the 1990s and 2000s, economic growth, healthcare, and moral values came to the forefront. Bill Clinton famously ran on the mantra, "It's the economy, stupid," while George W. Bush's 2004 re-election hinged on national security concerns after 9/11. In recent decades, immigration, climate change, gun control, racial justice, and LGBTQ+ rights have polarized the electorate. The 2020 election, held during the COVID-19 pandemic and widespread racial protests, was defined by debates over public health, economic relief, and social justice. As America continues to change, so do the issues that define its elections. Each presidential race becomes a mirror of the nation's most pressing debates and the vision of the future that voters believe in most. Voter behavior in U.S. history has never been static. It evolves with the nation's demographics, culture, and political climate. Initially, voting was a privilege restricted almost entirely to white male property owners. In the early republic, this narrow electorate reflected elite control. But by the 1820s and 1830s, during the Jacksonian era, most states dropped property requirements, greatly expanding the electorate to include nearly all white men. The fight for universal suffrage became one of the central themes of American history. African American men were granted the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, 1870, following the Civil War, although enforcement was weak. Southern states soon passed Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, and literacy tests to suppress black votes, a suppression that lasted for nearly a century. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, spurred by the Civil Rights Movement, that many black Americans in the South could vote freely. Women's suffrage was another historic struggle. After decades of activism, the 19th Amendment, 1920, finally gave women the right to vote, dramatically shifting the political landscape. Later, the 26th Amendment, 1971, lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, largely influenced by the Vietnam War and the argument that if young people could be drafted, they should be allowed to vote. Throughout the 20th century, voter behavior increasingly reflected divides based on race, gender, class, region, and education. For example, black voters became a reliable base for the Democratic Party after the 1960s. White evangelicals shifted strongly Republican in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. Latino and Asian American voters, once politically fragmented, are now emerging. as powerful blocs, though not monolithic in places like California, Florida, and Texas. Urban areas tend to vote Democrat, while rural areas lean Republican, a trend especially evident in the 2000s and 2010s. Youth turnout has historically lagged behind older generations, though moments of crisis, like the Vietnam War or the climate crisis, have driven spikes in youth activism. In contrast, older voters consistently show the highest turnout rates, giving them outsized influence in elections. In modern elections, data analytics, micro-targeting, and AI-based campaigning now allow candidates to tailor messages to very specific demographic groups, further influencing how voters behave and engage with political messages. From its earliest days, the U.S. electoral system has faced controversies, many of which go to the heart of democratic legitimacy. The Electoral College itself is a source of frequent debate, originally created as a compromise between direct popular vote and congressional selection. Over time, its ability to elect presidents who lose the popular vote, such as in 1876, 2000, and 2016, has fueled ongoing calls for reform. Voter suppression is a deeply embedded part of U.S. electoral history. After the Civil War, despite constitutional amendments, Southern states used violence, fraud, and discriminatory laws to prevent Black citizens from voting. The Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck down many of these practices, but in recent years, voter ID laws, limited polling places, and purging of voter rolls have reignited accusations of modern voter suppression, often targeting minorities, the poor, and the elderly. Gerrymandering, or the manipulation of electoral district boundaries for partisan advantage, has distorted representation for centuries. Though it dates back to the early 1800s, named after Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, gerrymandering has become increasingly precise and controversial with modern mapping software. Election interference, both foreign and domestic, is another major challenge. In the 2016 election, Russian interference through cyber attacks and social media manipulation shocked the American public and led to investigations that exposed vulnerabilities in the system. It revived concerns not only about national security, but about the spread of misinformation, which now spreads rapidly through digital platforms. Legal challenges to election results have also punctuated U.S. history. One of the most famous occurred in 2000, when the presidential race between George W. Bush and Al Gore came down to a razor-thin margin in Florida. A Supreme Court decision ultimately halted a recount, effectively handing the presidency to Bush. This case raised questions about judicial involvement in elections and electoral integrity. In addition, mail-in ballots, which surged during the EU 2020 pandemic election, became a point of deep partisan divide, with false claims of widespread fraud undermining public trust. The January 6, 2021 Capitol insurrection, following claims of a stolen election, represented one of the most severe challenges to U.S. democracy in modern history. These controversies highlight that while the U.S. electoral system is resilient, it remains subject to human flaws, power struggles, and technological vulnerabilities. Each generation must address these challenges anew to preserve the ideals of free and fair elections. Some U.S. presidential elections have been so pivotal, controversial, or transformative that they reshape the nation's political, social, or constitutional trajectory. These landmark contests tell the story of America's evolving democracy. Perhaps the most consequential election in American history, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, marked a point of no return in the slavery debate. Running as the first Republican to win the presidency, Lincoln's opposition to the expansion of slavery into Western territories prompted 7 Southern states to secede, even before his inauguration. His election directly triggered the Civil War, a national conflict that would ultimately end slavery but at a cost of over 600,000 lives. In the depths of the Great Depression, Americans overwhelmingly rejected President Herbert Hoover and elected Franklin D. Roosevelt, who promised a New Deal to restore economic stability. This election redefined the role of government in American life, leading to large-scale federal programs, labor protections, and welfare systems. It also realigned party politics, cementing a democratic coalition of urban workers, minorities, and the poor for decades. The 1960 election was the first where televised debates played a crucial role. John F. Kennedy's calm, youthful image contrasted with Richard Nixon's tired appearance, giving him an edge in the eyes of millions. It was also one of the closest elections in U.S. history, with a margin of just 0.17% in the popular vote. Kennedy's Catholicism, youth, and charisma signaled a generational shift in American politics. The election between George W. Bush and Al Gore ended in one of the most controversial political episodes in modern U.S. history. A recount in Florida was halted by the Supreme Court in Bush versus Gore, effectively awarding Bush the presidency despite losing the popular vote. The case exposed flaws in ballot design and state-run election systems, and it highlighted how elections could hinge on legal battles rather than just ballots. Battles rather than just ballots. In a deeply symbolic and transformational election, Barack Obama became the first African-American president of the United States. Running on the message of hope and change during a global financial crisis, Obama's win energized young voters and minorities and marked a cultural milestone in a country with a legacy of slavery and segregation. His campaign's use of digital tools also revolutionized electioneering for the 21st century. The election of Donald Trump, a political outsider and billionaire reality TV star, defied all conventional wisdom. Running on a platform of nationalism, immigration restriction, and anti-establishment sentiment, Trump defeated Hillary Clinton despite losing the popular vote. His win exposed deep political and cultural divides and ushered in an era of hyperpolarization, disinformation, and populist resurgence across the globe. Each of these elections reflects the shifting dynamics of American politics, where leadership, crisis, technology, and identity collide to shape the future. As the U.S. moves deeper into the 21st century, the future of its elections will likely be defined by two forces: technological advancement and the struggle for democratic integrity. On the technology front, elections are already being shaped by big data, AI-driven voter analytics, and social media micro-targeting. Tools developed to predict consumer behavior are now used to forecast voter turnout and influence decisions, raising ethical questions about privacy and manipulation. As cybersecurity threats increase, both from foreign powers and domestic sources, ensuring secure digital infrastructure has become a national priority. Calls for electoral reform are growing louder. Proposals like ranked choice voting, open primaries, and proportional representation are gaining momentum in cities and states dissatisfied with winner-takes-all models and extreme partisanship. Alaska and Maine have already implemented ranked choice systems, potentially modeling broader change. Youth engagement will be a decisive factor. Millennials and Gen Z are the largest voting bloc, yet they've historically had lower turnout. However, movements around climate action, gun control, and racial justice have sparked new waves of activism. The future of American democracy may hinge on whether these young voters stay engaged and push for a more inclusive and equitable system. Meanwhile, the U.S. faces a critical reckoning with voter suppression, disinformation, and election denialism. After the 2020 election, false claims of fraud undermined trust in the electoral process and culminated in the January 6th Capitol riot, a historic attack on democratic institutions. The response to these threats, through legislation, civic education, and institutional reform, will determine whether the U.S. strengthens or weakens its democratic foundations. Lastly, America's elections will continue to have a global impact. As a superpower, the leaders it elects influence international trade, climate policy, military strategy, and human rights. The rest of the world watches U.S. elections not just for their spectacle, but for what they signal about the health of liberal democracy itself. In short, the future of U.S. elections will depend not just on innovation, but on whether the nation can resolve its internal divisions and reaffirm its commitment to democratic principles. From its revolutionary birth to its modern complexity, the history of U.S. politics and presidential elections is the history of an experiment in democracy, often messy, frequently tested, but remarkably enduring. Over more than 2 centuries, the electoral process has been a battlefield for ideas, ideologies, and identity, reflecting the evolving character of the American people and the nation's foundational struggle between power and liberty. The framers of the Constitution could not have imagined the high-tech campaigns, 24/7 media cycles, or global scrutiny that define modern elections, but they built a framework flexible enough to adapt over time, one that could accommodate abolishing slavery, expanding the franchise, and incorporating new voices into the political arena. Each generation of Americans has shaped and reshaped the meaning of citizenship through elections. The long fight for voting rights, from abolitionists and suffragettes to the civil rights movement and modern-day reformers, proves that democracy is not a static gift, but a continual struggle. Every milestone came not easily, but through protest, resistance, legislation, and civic courage. Presidential elections have often served as national turning points. They've brought the U.S. through its darkest hours: the Civil War, economic collapse, world wars, cultural revolutions, and now digital disruption and political polarization. In each era, the electoral process has been both a reflection of the current crisis and a compass for future direction. At the same time, the system has never been without flaws. From disenfranchisement and corruption to partisan manipulation and misinformation, the challenges have been many. Yet despite these obstacles, the American people have repeatedly risen to the task of redefining democracy through the vote. As history shows, elections are not just contests of candidates, but of competing visions for what America is and what it should become. They are acts of collective decision-making that chart the nation's moral, social, and political course. Whether in 1800 or 2024, a U.S. presidential election is never just about one leader. It's about who gets to be heard, who gets to decide, and how the nation sees itself. In understanding the history of U.S. politics and presidential elections, we uncover not just a story of power, but of participation. And that story continues to unfold, one vote at a time.